Good morning, everyone, and welcome to PrimeTime. PrimeTime is a Bethel Library program that is a collaboration between the Friends of the Bethel University Library, Academic Affairs, and other offices on campus that celebrates learning in and beyond the classroom of Bethel faculty, students, and staff. Thanks for joining us. If you miss any presentations or would like to see any past events, they are archived in the Community Video Collection in the Bethel Digital Library on the library website. Join us again this Thursday, December 7, when Edgren Scholars Associate Professor of Biological Studies Dr. Melissa Cordes and Senior Neuroscience Major Emily Schmidt present their research about what songbirds can teach us about the motivation to communicate. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Assistant Professor and Field Director of Social Work Nick Zeimet in a conversation about pursuing justice with Minnesota State Senator Mary Kunesh. Nick, I'll leave it to you to introduce Senator Kunesh.
Thank you, Ray. Well, I'm super excited about our prime time today. This presentation is an extension of a series we have held all fall and will continue into the spring in the social work department called our Human Experience series. And it's nestled under our efforts to really help our students understand what we mean when we say that competent social workers are those who can practice ADEI social work. ADEI standing for anti-racism, diverse, equitable, and inclusive social work practices. And so before we get started, before I introduce Senator Kunesh, I'm just going to read through our competency as a reminder to our students who are here and as a form of education to our non-social work students about one of the competencies that make up social workers. So competency number 3 says to engage in anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion in practice. Social workers understand how racism and oppression shape human experiences and how these two constructs influence practice at the individual, family, group, organizational, and community levels in policy and research. Social workers understand the pervasive impact of white supremacy and privilege and use their knowledge, awareness, and skills to engage in anti-racist practice. Social workers understand how diversity and intersectionality shape human experiences and identity development and affect equity and inclusion. The dimensions of diversity are understood as the intersectionality of factors including but not limited to age, caste, class, color, culture, disability and ability, ethnicity, gender identity and expression, generational status, immigration status, legal status, marital status, political ideology, race, nationality, religion and spirituality, sex and sexual orientation, and tribal sovereign status. Social workers understand that this intersectionality means that a person's life experiences may include oppression, poverty, marginalization, and alienation, as well as privilege and power. Social workers understand the societal and historical roots of social and racial injustices and the forms and mechanisms of oppression and discrimination, and they recognize the extent to which a culture's structures and values, including social, economic, political, racial, technological, and cultural exclusions, may create privilege and power and systemically oppress, marginalize, and alienate. So, I'm very excited that my state senator, State Senator Mary Kunesh is able to join us today just for a conversation about how a lot of these constructs just show up in our lives. And specifically, Senator Kunesh will talk about some of her experiences and some of her experiences in her legislative experience, as well as her public experience. So I'd like to introduce Senator Mary Kunesh, who is a Standing Rock Lakota descendant, was elected to the Minnesota House of Representatives in 2016 and elected to the Senate in 2020. She is the first woman of Native descent to be elected a Minnesota senator. Senator Kunesh retired from her role as a public school library media specialist after 25 years of service and is currently the chair of the Education Finance Committee in the Minnesota Senate. Senator Kunesh is the author of the legislation and chair of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force in Minnesota, and which was the first in the nation, Missing and Murdered African American Women's Task Force. She also created the first in the nation permanent office of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives in state government. Mary has served as an assistant majority leader for the DFL House Caucus and currently holds the role of assistant majority leader in the Minnesota Senate, the first Native American to hold that role in the legislature. Mary is a founding member of the Minnesota Native American Legislative and POCI caucus, which is the People of Color Indigenous caucuses. Mary lives in New Brighton and is the proud mother of 3 adults and 2 granddaughters. So, welcome, Senator Mary Kunesh. Mary, thank you for being here. And I'm wondering if you could just start with a personal introduction.
Sure.
And maybe just adding on to that, just talk a little bit about your motivation for public service, both in the public education sphere, where you spent many years, and then most recently now in the legislature.
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me here, Nick, and holding it in the library, my very happy place. I'm like, my head is spinning around looking at all the books, like, ooh, I don't know if I've seen that one before. But I am really happy to be here and talk about the work that I've been able to do, and I feel really fortunate and privileged to have had the serendipitous life that I've had. I was born in St. Paul. I'm the 9th of 13 children. I have a twin brother. He's number 8 and I'm number 9. And when I was about 2 years old, my dad moved us up to what was then the little village of Sartell. So I grew up in Stearns County, where my dad was by profession a lawyer, but was really active in, looking back, we can now call it social justice issues. At one time, he was the city attorney for St. Cloud, Stearns County attorney, and then was also director of a program called Rural Crime and Justice that studied rural crime and justice in Minnesota, which is a pretty fascinating topic. And I wish he was still around that we could ask him more about that. But all of those things that he did, he brought home to us. And we sat around with my mom and he discussed these things during dinner. As I grew up, there was the issue at Wounded Knee and Alcatraz Island. My dad was a card-carrying AIM member. He himself was not Native. It was my mom who was an enrolled tribal member of the Standing Rock Nation, but he was absolutely supportive of the indigenous people and did a lot of pro bono work for the tribes, the northern tribes in Minnesota. And I think that's what really planted that seed of sort of social justice. But I think also growing up in a family of 13, we learned really early the importance of working together for the common good. And when we put our skills and when we worked together and collaborated well with each other, we got a lot of stuff done, and that meant we had more time to go play in the creek and run around and do all the things that we did. And so I feel like my childhood, while there were always, some things, struggles, it prepared me for some of the work that I did. When I left St. Cloud and Sartell area, I came down here and went to a year and a half at St. Kate's and totally ran out of money and could not continue to go to school. But I found that the world had opened up to me, and so I would work very much, I would work a lot waitressing, and then take all my money and go travel overseas or around the States. And again, that really helped open up my mind. And I eventually married a guy from the Middle East, from Lebanon. And so my children, which is kind of interesting, having indigenous roots, they also are first generation Middle Eastern, which is, it's sort of a weird dichotomy, but again, the world opened up to me and I understood the cause and effect, just like what's happening right now. Probably get really emotional here. What's happening in Palestine and Israel, the decision of one or two people rocks the world. And and has the devastating effects across the world as well. So those were the kind of things that I think have moved me over the years to where I am now. When I was in my mid-30s, I found myself a single mom, and that's when I went back to school. So I was doing family daycare, waitressing on the weekends, raising my 3 kids with their dad. We lived only a few blocks apart, but was going to school, went back to St. Kate's and went to school, weekend college to finish my degree. So I did not become a teacher until I was 35 years old, which, for most people, and I missed the rule of 90 by 1 year. I was sort of a late bloomer, and I was really intentional about being in a public school setting. I went to parochial elementary, high school, and then St. Kate's, but I recognized that there seemed to be a threat for public education, and I wanted to make sure that all of our kids, wherever they lived in Minnesota, had access to a really good quality, free education, no matter what the family's choice was. And so that's what kept me busy for a number of years. And it was the families and the communities and the people that I worked with that I think really moved me to that next level of advocacy to run for office. I'm really fortunate. I'm a Democrat, member of the DFL caucus. I'm very fortunate to live in a strong DFL community. And when the opportunity came for me to run for office, I spoke with a couple of different people. I have 2 kids that have political science degrees. Should I run? Well, yeah, Mom. But also I spoke with the teachers that I was working with and said, if I ran for office, what would you want me to do? And they just, I remember it was after school and some teachers were in my library and we just started talking and they're like, I made a long list of all the things that these teachers would have liked to see changed at the legislature. And so because of all these really unique life experiences, I feel like I am now, very fortunate to be in this time and this place and doing the work that I get to do. And as the chair of Education Finance, I was able to have a big conversation and influence on how we spent that $5.3 billion on public education last year. I sit on the AG committee, so I work a lot with rural communities as well. I'm just really lucky and really fortunate to be, able to make these kind of decisions for the state of Minnesota, and hopefully they're the right decisions and they'll move Minnesota in a good direction.
Yeah. You were sharing with a group of us prior to coming here, and you shared a little bit just even in this question or just talking about kind of individuals and life, not only, how your life experiences have kind of shaped and helped you get to this space. But I'm wondering if you can maybe talk a little bit about what influences, now that you're in the legislature, what influences how you are thinking about decisions or problems or issues that people are bringing. Again, you were talking earlier, just the power of stories. Here, just connection to just what's going on internationally and the power of stories. Can you say just a little bit about where are your influences when you think about priorities, what you want to do and accomplish on behalf of constituents and just the greater area of Minnesota? What influences you as you come to that work?
I would say that the things that influence me the most are the stories that people tell me. So this summer I spent a lot of time with our agriculture committee, traveling around and visiting with the farmers and talking with them about what is their struggle and what do they see. I always ask people, like, how would you fix this problem? You said there's a problem. What are the details? What would you do to fix that problem? And a lot of the time it felt like at the legislature we're just sort of addressing, that top layer of angst and not looking at the root of the problem. And so I'm always trying to get to the root of the problem. If kids are not graduating at a rate that we want, like 100% rate, what are the problems? What are the barriers that are keeping those kids from graduating? Is it because they're not interested, which a lot of the time it is? And I had a daughter that I swear I was certain she was going to quit high school, and I was able to find an alternative way for her to get that high school diploma. But how can we, get to the root of the problem for any sort of thing and work from that bottom up? I think I mentioned that I often I look at legislation like a lesson plan or a unit in my teaching, But first of all, I want to know, what do I want to get out of the end? What is the outcome that we're looking for? Build an objective. Look at the resources that we have. What are the resources that we need? Who do we need to talk to? And when I say who do we talk to, I want to talk to experts. I want to talk to people who have been affected by the issue, whether it's the good, the bad, or the ugly. I'm a really curious person, so I want to hear, I want to learn more. And then, I really have to sort of trust my own gut instinct, because sometimes what I think we should do or should happen, people will look at me like, well, no, that's not what we want to do, or that's not right. And when I kind of go back and give them my reasoning, they're like, oh, we hadn't thought about it like that. But at the same time, making sure that I'm listening to them as well, and then formulating what seems to be the best solution. Sometimes there isn't a solution, or maybe now isn't the right time to do something. I don't want to make decisions that are going to have a negative effect.
I'm wondering in that, because in social work we have sometimes similar problems where that surface level, like we want to solve the thing that we all see, right? Like, let's just fix this real quick, and then oftentimes the problem just presents itself in a new outward way. So I'm just wondering, as you listen to stories and you're talking to farmers, or you're talking to community members, how does that get translated to then other people that you might be working with who might discredit, say, the stories? They call it anecdotal. They want to minimize the stories. In social work, we oftentimes say that you are the expert of your own lived experience, right? Like, I'm not the expert. I might know theories and know other things, but I'm not the expert of your lived experience. How have you found, and if so, then how do you go about trying to counter that argument that might want to dismiss testimony or lived personal experiences as anecdotal, or to minimize that?
Sure. That's a really good question, because while those stories might move a person, it's really the data and the numbers that really move and flow dollars to make a difference. You almost have to prove that people are miserable before, they're motivated to do anything about that. And I guess what I would just remind another person, if they are being dismissive, or they might have negative reaction to a really heartfelt testimony, that this is a person's reality. This is the truth of the matter for them. This is their lived experience. And it might be that this has been going on for generation after generation, where you can connect those dots for the different reasons. And then, historically, how have we put barriers in place to prevent especially those communities of color and those with the most disparities, how we, say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but then we put all these dead ends and barriers in place and don't seek to remove them. And so it's just going to keep happening. And yes, sometimes somebody can pull themselves up or dig themselves out or move themselves out of a certain situation. But if it's the same old, and we're not removing those barriers, then we're really doing an injustice. And for me, I try to explain that. I try to speak to it. Sometimes there are people that are so tone deaf, that it's not going to make a difference no matter what I say. But I still have to say it because I need to say it for myself, oftentimes for, advocating for whoever it is. But also I want to put that in that person's mind so that maybe it's going to make them a little more reflective, or they're going to think twice, or when they hear it enough times, maybe they'll say, oh, okay, maybe she was right.
Sure. I didn't send you this question as one I might ask you, but I'm kind of curious, would you be comfortable sharing a time in whatever general way that you feel comfortable, where doing that very thing was maybe uncomfortable for you? It stretched you. It had you doing it. You were kind of outside your comfort zone a little bit by kind of challenging somebody. Has that happened for you, whether it was in the public school or in the legislature? Where just when you said the word advocating, it jumped out to me. Oftentimes. If there wasn't a space of discomfort, it probably isn't advocacy, right? You're probably saying the same thing. And so I'm just wondering if you feel comfortable kind of talking about or what is that like for you to step out of that comfort zone and to advocate against resistance maybe?
I think the thing that comes to mind is as the library media specialist in an elementary school, it fell onto me to be the testing coordinator. And it was a K through fifth grade school. And MCAs, that spring season, and maybe these students are still having flashbacks to all of that, is a really, really, really rough time for students, for teachers, for administrator, for the district. It's just miserable. These tests I don't feel are really centered on the student in a good way. It causes a lot of anxiety. It causes a lot of stress, both in adults and students. It's the springtime, so it's starting to get hot, and kids want to be outside. They are done with school, and yet we make them sit down and take these hours of testing. And so because I was the testing administrator, I tried to set the testing situation up in the best way. I had 2 computer labs. I brought in extra fans to keep things cool. I tried to create a really positive environment. I worked with the teachers really hard to find the right time of day for their students. They know their students better. Are they going to be better in the morning? Are they going to be better in the afternoon? What days seem to be better? It was a lot of logistics to find just the right balance, who's going to sit next to who needs to have some space off to themselves where we can still monitor. And it's very, it's not as easy as one might think. And we had a principal that had a history of disrupting schools in a negative way. And unfortunately, she came to our school. And it was the very first day of testing. And she walked in and, for whatever reason, decided she was going to mix everything up and change the schedule. And it was very, I also had to teach my classes, so I had to schedule around my classes as well. And she just shook everything up, and it went bananas for that first day, and then it was going to continue. And so I walked up to her, and I really, in a polite, respectful way, just told her that she just destroyed everything that we had worked so hard for. And she did not like me telling her that. And, this was the beginning of, the era where speak your truth, be thoughtful, be mindful, advocate, step up and speak for yourself, or, that kind of thing. And we had just had a professional training on all of that. And she just, read me the Riot Act. And I just said, look, I'm speaking from my experience. I'm speaking from my truth. I'm speaking from my heart. We had this set up in the best way, and you have just destroyed all of this. Can we please go back to the original schedule? And then she got very upset with me, said, no, we couldn't do that. I had to go over her head, which she didn't like, and we went back to the original schedule. And from that point on, she tried to make my life as miserable as possible. I mean, at one point, by the end of that school year, she tried to eliminate my position eliminate the position of a library media specialist in the school so that she could get rid of me. And the superintendent said, no, you're not going to do that. But that was probably, the first time that I really stood up to an authoritarian position and spoke my truth and spoke my mind. And from then on, I wasn't afraid to, and I did it in a respectful way and in a constructive manner, but I wasn't afraid to speak out and advocate for these kids anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because it's, one of the things we try to do in our educational spaces is do some sober education, right? So, yes, speak our truths, and let's advocate, and let's, all of the things. And we also want to be very sober-minded and say sometimes, maybe even oftentimes, that's going to come with some consequences or come with some discomfort, that there really isn't. Sometimes we just can't strategize around, and we kind of live with the things. And so I really appreciate how you framed that up in this centering of truth, the things you knew about your students. And so I appreciate you sharing that story. I wondered if we've got about 10-15 more minutes here just to talk, and then we'll take some questions from some people. I'm very proud that you represent the area that I live in. My son has had the great pleasure, my 9-year-old son, of coming and sitting in on a committee hearing that Senator Kunesh has led and testifying. And he likes to say it was his testimony that led to free lunches in the elementary school. In schools, he likes to take credit for that. So I hope you allow him that space.
Absolutely.
But,
absolutely.
One of the things that I'm really proud of, when just knowing you and having a relationship with you, is say my senator is a kind of a groundbreaker. You've done, in your short time in the legislature, and both as a representative and as a senator, you've done some really significant things in Minnesota. We talk in social work about one of our foundational theories is systems theory. And just this morning we were talking about, systems don't like to change. Systems like to kind of keep doing things the way they've kind of always done them, even if they know that it's maybe not working for everyone. So I'm wondering if you could, not everyone may know some of the real groundbreaking new things that you have helped lead in your short time in the legislature, both again as a representative and as a senator. I'm wondering if you could just kind of brag a little bit on the work that you have been a part of. I know that's what you would say. I've been a part of this work. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. And as you do that, maybe just talk about going back again to the why. Imagine it was a lot of physical work, but probably a lot of emotional and mental work as well.
Yeah.
So if you could share your why for that work, and as you also talk, what were some of the barriers or resistance that came up as you tried to do some of that work?
Sure. Well, the very first bill that I ever passed we called it the buttocks bill. I had a constituent come to me and say she was at the health club and this guy came up and touched her bottom. And when she complained, the manager said, well, we can't do anything because there's a carve out in legislation that we can't prosecute somebody if they come up and touch you through your clothes. If you have clothing on your bottom and they come up and touch you, we can't prosecute you. And I thought, that's the most absurd thing I've heard. So I went and looked at the statute, and sure enough, there was this carve out, and I started asking people, what in the world? And there's dates that show when things have been amended and changed, and people kind of laugh and say, oh, that's the locker room exemption. And I'm like, what? When guys are in the locker room and they're smacking each other's butts, you can't prosecute them for that. So that was one of the very first bills that I passed, and that came from a constituent. That's a really common sense one, and like I said, people just chuckled about it, and oh, isn't this funny? It's and I was like, no, this is not funny. This is absolutely not funny. And then they're like, oh, okay, maybe we better get serious. But a couple things that I'm most proud of is that I created the task force to study the missing and murdered Indigenous women here in Minnesota. And as I said, or you said, my mom's family is from the Standing Rock Nation, and my ancestors were fraught with, really horrific situations being Indigenous people, including my mother's cousin Elsie, who we believe was missing and murdered. She was murdered. She didn't go missing, but she was murdered, and it was, poo-pooed, and the evidence is pretty obvious, but nothing ever happened, and that was, that's been a continued kind of mantra around Indigenous people that are murdered or go missing. And as a consequence of that, we created the Permanent Office of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office to continue to study this work. In January, you will find that if you have to change out your license plate, we will now have MMIR license plate here in Minnesota. That was a bill that I just passed. And then in conjunction with that, as soon as we passed the MMIW task force, Representative Ruth Richardson and I created the Missing and Murdered African American Women's Task Force, because those are the two populations that are most vulnerable to this kind of violence. So those are some of the things that I've been working on. I do a lot of work with the tribes and the nations. We just were able to return a 10-mile tract of land to the Upper Sioux community that were sacred lands that had burial mounds and had been turned into a state park. So people were recreating on basically a native cemetery and the site of one of the most horrific slaughters of American Indians in our history. And we were able this past year to return that back to that community. We outlawed Indian mascots. We allowed students to wear eagle feather when they graduate from high school. They can wear their sacred tobacco pouch. I mean, these are the things we had to legislate, which seem kind of silly when you list them out. But up until then, every spring we would have parents calling saying, why can't they wear an eagle? I mean, Native kids graduate at the lowest levels of any group. Why would we not let them do that? I have passed the Equal Rights Amendment, both in the House and in the Senate. And now we have to get it passed again in the House this next session and get it put on the next ballot for the voters to decide. Should we include a equal rights statement in our Constitution? So I passed that in the House, and I just passed it in the Senate, and now we have to get the House to do it. What else have I done? Oh, have you all been following the new flag and emblem legislation? I'm the author of that in the Minnesota Senate. It's been such an incredible process. It's just been quite an incredible time. Just a lot of really, I feel, things that I'm very proud of this past session, as I mentioned, we passed the most comprehensive investment in public school education that we have in decades and decades, from early childhood all the way through community ed and adult ed. I have that whole spectrum, and we put so much money into the areas that have been divested in from forever and ever, and we're already starting to see the things. So any public school student can have a no-cost breakfast and lunch. That barrier isn't there anymore. We put a lot of money into school social workers and mental health support. As a librarian, for the first time in probably 50 years, we put the biggest investment in our public school libraries as well as our school libraries, looking to increase our licensed library media specialists so that they can support the schools and do the good work that they do. It's just been one thing after the other, and I feel like, I mean, I have not received hardly any negative responses, just a lot of really positive things from people who obviously are paying attention. But I think we're at a time where most Minnesotans want to see us doing this kind of work, and I'm really excited to be there doing it.
Wonderful, thank you. One last question, and then we'll take some questions. So be thinking about some questions you might want to ask in our last 10 minutes. Again, for our social work students, getting back to engagement in ADEI social work practice, what would you say to a future social worker that might be here, future education student that might be here, maybe a future nursing student, those who might be working in community spaces? What would you say to them as far as how to engage in systems that sometimes can just be frustrating because of, again, whether it's the systems approach, we've always done it this way, you're rocking the boat here, perhaps it's in, again, political, cultural kind of climate things. But you had said earlier, trust in your gut, and kind of like sometimes, like, we do a lot of work of just trying to help students, like what's right here, right? Like what's all right. But sometimes systems don't always help you in doing sometimes the right thing. So in some of the challenging work that maybe you've done, are there some pieces of wisdom you've learned that you maybe want to leave students with, faculty with? As far as what it's like to be an individual who's trying to do good work in systems that sometimes just are cumbersome, take time, or are just flat out maybe resistant.
Well, that's a really hard thing, especially when change seems to take forever. And I'm sort of an impatient person, like, let's do this, let's get it done now. We know we need to make some changes here, let's just do it. I would suggest, well, first of all, if you are going into social work, nursing, or education, thank you. These are not easy professions in this day and age. They are not going to make you wealthy. You oftentimes will go home exhausted socially, emotionally, and physically. And oftentimes there's very little thanks for the work that you're doing. But I want to say a huge thank you. When you find yourself in a position where you think you can make a positive difference or have a suggestion, I would suggest really almost preparing yourself to present a solution. Oftentimes people will come to us with the problem, and I always ask, what's your solution? What should we do? If we could do one thing right now to make a good positive change, whether it's just a small tweak here, just some little language change, that's instead of saying must, you can say may. I mean, what are some small changes that we can start with and then have some, whether it's anecdotal evidence or here's what we found is going on in our neck of the woods, but always come to us with some kind of idea for a solution, because a lot of times people will drop things on my lap that I don't know anything about, and they want me to fix it. And so think about how you could best fix whatever it is that you're seeing is ailing the work that you do. And, when you bring it up to somebody, whether it's your supervisor or your administrator or your legislator, just again, speak from your heart, and just know that things might not change right this minute, but if you are persistent enough, and if you're willing to step out and step up and continue, not just once, but go back again and again and again. And if you're coming to a dead end, I think of all the time, especially the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force. I would come to a dead end and I was like, oh my gosh, now what? This isn't working. I don't know what to do next. I was a new legislator, and my assistant and I would just look at each other like, oh, we can't stop. What are we going to do next? And then all of a sudden a door would open up and we would take it and run. So look for those opportunities and those people that might be an ally to changing the work that you want to do in a good way.
Thank you. Well, we'll pause here, and I don't know if there's any online questions from that community, but we'll leave some time here if there's some questions in this audience. Susan.
I just am wondering, I was thinking as you were talking about, think of ways that when we ask questions of solutions that we might have. So I was going to ask this big question, reparations, what do you think? And so, but do you have ideas of how we can break that down into practical ways that as individuals we can be thinking more about, you just look at I just read the book called What Does Justice Look Like by a Lakota woman. She read it about 15 years ago, and she had ideas about how to make changes at Fort Snelling, which some of them have been implemented. And just thinking of all the historical atrocities, in our very state against Indigenous people. And, can you break down any small ideas of what we could do as individuals to repair some of that?
Just for our online community, the question was, can Senator Kunesh break down atrocities that have happened to communities within our state? The topic of reparations came up, but I think there might just be kind of that, when we break it down, what are some thoughts you have about?
Well, reparations is such a huge, huge topic. And when I was in the Minnesota House, there was a Representative Karen Clark, who had this reparations bill. But it included for the African American, the Black community, as well as the Native community in one bill. And when she left, she handed it over to me. And I said, this is more than I could, this is too much. And reparations looks different for the Indigenous people than for the Black people. It's very different. These are the lands that our Native folks lived on for centuries before colonization happened. For our African American folks, they were brought here and enslaved here. And so, and I don't know the history of our Black folks that well as I do for the Native folks, and I didn't feel quite ready for that one. So we split that into two different ones. And like you said, it's such a big issue. How do we even bite off a little bit of it? So I have been working on some legislation that could be called reparations, or bits and pieces of individual legislation, like you said, the changes at Fort Snelling and the return of the land for Upper Sioux, allowing our tribal police departments to operate independently of the counties, the sheriffs, because when tribes wanted to create their own police departments, the state said, okay, you can, but you have to do it in conjunction and have it overseen by the county sheriffs, because obviously, like we wouldn't know how to deal with our own folks. Well, we've been slowly breaking those bonds. I was able to pass legislation to do that for Prairie Island and Mille Lacs, and we'll try to do that for all of the tribes. So it's sort of taking off bits and pieces, bites here and there. I have always been mindful and have tried to ask the tribes for leadership in these areas. Rather than me coming in, and it's the same with the MMIW task force, me saying, here's a piece of legislation I created for you, so look at me, we're doing such good work. I always go to the tribes first and ask them, do you like this idea? Would you like me to work on this? Do you have ideas of how this should happen? And so I think it's important that we confer with the tribes, all of them being sovereign nations. And here's the big $10 million question. How many of you know how many federally recognized tribes there are in Minnesota?
I do now, yeah.
See, this is a question I ask people. And we are so woefully undereducated about the sovereign rights of our tribal nations across the nation. There are 11. Just to give you that answer, I'm sure you'll never forget this now. There are 7 Ojibwe Anishinaabe from the Twin Cities North and our 4 Dakota from the Twin Cities South. There's a lot of information to learn about all of that. So when you ask about reparations, I do have a really interesting bill that I'm working on. I've actually been working on for 7 years. We used to call it the Michael Miller Bill. Now we call it the IRA, Indian Recovery Act. And it was 2 Scandinavian white older gentlemen that came to me. They're active in a faith-based organization in South Minneapolis, and they said, we have this idea. And basically, it is a very, very, very small excise tax on any transaction, any real estate transaction that happens in Minnesota. So 0.0005% of that real estate transaction, because it's the land, we're talking about the land, would go into a fund at the state government, and then that would go to a pass-through MIAC, Minnesota Indian Affairs Council, to the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. And the tribes would be able to use those dollars in the way that they best see it. We're not going to tell them exactly how you have to spend it. We had a long list, like education, housing, healthcare, home ownership, whatever it is, and being able to repurchase the lands. But we also didn't want to limit it to that, and so there would be a council built within that Indian Land Foundation that would be able to garner those grants to the tribes. And so that's like the one that I'm going to work on the most this next session. But I would say for each and every one of you, educate yourself, educate yourself, educate yourself. Right now there is so much incredible literature out there. There are so many incredible movies. How many of you watch the Murder of the Osage, the Blood Moon,
Blood Memory?
Killer of the Flower Moon, thank you. There's so much out there. Go to TPT, and there is a series there called Little Bird. I'm going to tell you the first 2 segments are extremely, extremely difficult and emotional, but it talks about a young girl who family was a series of events where the children were removed from their family, the Native kids from Canada, of course, forced out of the family and put up for adoption, which is, you've heard about the boarding school era. My grandfather's brothers were sent from Standing Rock all the way to Carlisle in Pennsylvania, and those boys tried again and again to get home. They would run away, jump trains, and it wasn't until my Uncle Collie fell off of a train and had his leg cut off that they finally let him go home. I mean, these are the stories that our communities live with day in and day out, and there is so much information out there now. There never used to be. Missing and murdered, boarding school, all of these things. When you're talking about social work, ICWA, I hope that Bethel has a whole huge focus on the Indian Child Welfare Act. That's another thing I'm really proud of, because that act was being threatened at the federal level to go away, those special protections for tribes and children. And this time last year, I was working on a bill to shore up the Minnesota Indian Family Preservation Act. Should ICWA go away, we had our own little mini ICWA statutes here in Minnesota, and we passed that almost right away last session. So ICWA, how are we protecting our Native families and the kids from being removed like they have been in the past?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just even this morning in one of our classes, we were talking about the social studies curriculum. So not only as adults being educated, but I'll just, if I can, just add on to your great words here. Just making sure that we're educating young children as well about the different cultural and ethnic backgrounds and identities, and so we talked about that this morning.
Minnesota, we did pass legislation to create Indian education for all. So we will start having that in our school, as well as ethnic studies within the social studies curriculum, and that social studies curriculum is now going through review. Yeah.
So thank you for inviting us and making the space. Thank you, Senator Kunesh, for taking time out to come. I think we're going to end this, but feel free to stick around. I know you've got another commitment you need to run to, but if someone has a comment or question, maybe we can try to grab you before you leave. But
sure.
Thank you so much, and thank you.